Hello everybody, thank you very much for joining us. Maybe this is the second time you've joined us. We did do a webinar on M&A and divestments for SAP customers a few weeks ago in March. This time we're focusing much more on the buyer's perspective. Last time it was more around the SAP customer, the seller's perspective. And I'm joined again by Stephen Jerram from NTT DATA. He's one of the solution directors there. Between the two of us, we've both done about 25 years in SAP. So between the two of us, about 50 years helping SAP customers with their various challenges. Mine from more of a data migration perspective, Stephen maybe a wider solution and systems perspective. But together,
plenty of war stories, right, Ben? Plenty of
that's the hope, isn't it? Some of the mistakes we've made that will hopefully we can help you not make. But I think we'll be talking about as well some of the work that we've done together, both as organisations, Xmateria and NTT DATA, but also personally, me and Steve, and some of the work that we've done together on joint customers. So hopefully there's a lot there that we can talk to you about. So today is very much going to be around the buyer's perspective. So I think last time, Stephen, we talked about the specific challenges of M&A for SAP customers, and the fact that a lot of SAP customers will go through their career working on implementations and transformation programs and maybe cloud projects and technical upgrades, but they could go through they could go through a whole career without working on an acquisition or a divestment. And the point we made last time was that some of the challenges of M&A are quite unique. So, for example, this is very much. And last time when we were talking about a divestment, you're talking about selling off part of your business and taking in a fairly significant chunk of money for that. That is a CEO level decision. It's a board level priority. So it's got very, very high visibility within the organization. They're very much date-driven projects. A carve-out, will work back from the end of the TSA, whereas a normal SAP implementation would work more left to right. They can be technically highly complex, and also you're faced with one of the challenges that you are faced with this kind of project is you haven't got one customer. There's not one organization you're dealing with. You're dealing with a seller, you're dealing with the buyer, and then you're also dealing with the business that is being sold. So we talked about all of that last time, and I think today when we're talking about the kind of unique set of challenges, some of those are very specific to the buyer. The first one is the TSA, the Transition Services Agreement. That looms large. If this project overruns, the buyer is on the hook normally for some fairly significant penalties. So the way it will work is that the business that's being sold will continue to operate for a period of time within the seller's system post-deal. That could be a 6-month period, that could be a 2-year period. But at the end of that, if that business has not been separated from that environment, the buyer is potentially on the hook for some fairly significant penalties. So you have to be ready. You have to go into this with your eyes open.
You mentioned earlier, Ben, you said these projects are unique, right? They're not your typical SAP project. And whilst every project has a target deadline and go live, I think more than any other project type, a carve-out really has a very hard date in stone, right? That really, to a degree, helps focus the minds, but also presents in its own way a set of challenges.
That's right, and I think that was the phrase we used last time, wasn't it? Is consider that deadline set in stone. That must not move. You work back from that date and work out what's achievable. Whereas in a normal project, you would work out what it is you want to achieve and then put a date on that project. So yeah, that's a huge factor. And I think another one is from a buyer's perspective. This isn't just a project. The project is the means to the end, which is the longer term interest in and that's probably the biggest difference, the biggest difference in the priorities between the seller and the buyer. For the seller, this is a project, get it done, and move on. For the buyer, this is just the start. You obviously have a much longer term interest in the health of the business. And then the other challenge is you're very reliant on the seller. It's not your system, So if there's a separation to be done, that you're very reliant on the seller for access and for maybe extracts of the data that's there. So it's a very interesting set of challenges. And I think, Stephen, maybe let's just kind of delve into those a little bit. Who are the key players, and what's the role of the buyer in this kind of project?
Yeah, so so again, Ben, we spoke last time, didn't we? We spoke about the three entities involved: the seller, the buyer, and the divested organisation itself. We focused very heavily on the seller last time, so we're going to focus on the buyer today. We'll tell you what, Ben, let's focus on the buyer and the divested entity. If we talk about those as a joint thing for the purposes of this discussion, so it's on that end of the spectrum. So, if we think about what are the sort of key objectives and priorities of the buyer and the situation they're in? Well, they're potentially now, and as you described, Ben, this is the start of their journey rather than it being the end of a story from the seller's perspective. So they're now potentially, use the word, sort of unshackled from the seller, so they maybe have a bit more freedom and ability to plough their own furrow, and they've got really an immediate opportunity to potentially to invest and grow that independent business, or depending where it's going, right? Because so typically from Ben and I's experience, the buyer, well, it either tends to be what we consider to be like an industry buyer, so an organisation that for example, a chemicals organisation selling a part of their business to another chemicals organisation. So, and they may be being consumed onto that buyer's platform, potentially in some multiple stages. So there's a sort of an industry buyer scenario, but also quite commonly the buyer is actually a private equity business, and they've got some different perspectives. Maybe they want to see value a little bit quicker out of that potential sale, and they won't maybe be looking at it as a long term. They might have a time horizon, might be a 5-year cycle that they're looking at. But if we think about the priorities, regardless of which way round or what the sort of buyer type is, there's some sort of general priorities that they're going to have, right? So they're going to be, as you've alluded to and we've alluded to already, they're going to want to make sure they meet the terms and timelines of the TSA. They don't want to be spending additional money in penalties because we haven't got this exercise done quickly enough. So that's sort of number one. They're going to want to make sure that during this process, they can protect the actual business operations. Want to make sure that the thing they've bought is going to continue to run successfully as a standalone business. And they're going to be wanting to make sure that transition from being part of potentially a larger group to a standalone organization is a successful process. Now, it'll have some challenges outside of just the technology, right, Ben, in terms of, there'll be business challenges that will be taking place there. There might be organizational restructuring, all sorts of other aspects that will need the buyer to pay attention and make sure that transition is successful. And what they're really going to want to do is take advantage of that independence that they've now got to be able to potentially innovate, grow, and add value to that business. Because ultimately, what that buyer, and when we say buyer again, buyer/divested entity, what they're really trying to do is, like, the commercial objective there is to drive value from that acquisition. The seller had a good reason to offload that organization. The buyer sees potential value in that purchase, and they're going to want to make sure that they try to get hold of that value as quickly as they possibly can. So again, speed coming in there in multiple angles, right? Speed in terms of executing that carve out, but speed in terms of delivering the value for the buyer as well.
Yeah, I think you touch on a couple of points there that help to shape what a separation project might look like, depending on two things. I think one is, as you said, who's the buyer. So is that buyer private equity, meaning that the business that's being sold off will need to function as a standalone business? Because you've got the private equity ownership over the top, but essentially that's going to have to run and thrive and grow as a standalone business. if it's being, and if, let's say, for the sake of argument, the size of that business is 10% of the overall selling organization, you may find that the host SAP system that it's running in is far too big and complex for the size of that standalone business, versus if it's an industry buyer. So you gave the example of a chemical company. Let's say one chemical company buying a business from another. It may then get sucked into the buyer's SAP system, or whatever they're running on. So that
might take multiple steps, right? Ben, there might be interim staging times, depending on what the dynamics of the TSA and the time frames.
Yeah,
and we'll touch on a couple of those as we go forward.
Yeah, it could be a two-step thing, couldn't it?
Yeah.
And then the other factor is, and you touched on this as well, is speed. So speed of separation driven by the TSA versus the need to drive value from this project, and as you said, unshackled from the seller. Maybe there's a lighter, more innovative path that standalone company can follow. So, I think we'll come on to all of that today. So the way we've structured this, as we did with the last one, is around 5, hopefully fairly practical, helpful, simple points that will just help you in terms of how you think about this kind of project as a potential buyer, and how you would prepare. And I think the first one, and I see this all the time actually when talking to customers who have acquired a business, is know what you're going to get. Now, I think we're making the assumption today, because our audience today is mainly a technology audience and probably an SAP audience. So we're assuming that the business that's being sold is currently running on SAP. But if you're the buyer, you need to know what you're going to get. Now, you presumably know what you've bought. As a buying organization, you know what you've bought. Somebody knows what that is. Is it a legal entity? Is it a plant? Is it a product line represented by a set of profit centers? But you kind of know what you've bought. But I do talk to a lot of customers that don't actually know what they're going to get. So as part of that TSA, as part of that transitional agreement, what are you going to be given by the seller? Are they going to, and this would normally be the starting assumption as a very good place to begin. Are they going to carve out for you a running business, or are they expecting just to give you a set of extracts? That, and for that we're talking about that core ECC. But then, of course, you've got all the other systems, the satellite systems, standalone applications. There could be, it could even get down to kind of the level of, people running a set of spreadsheets. What is the totality of the system architecture that this business runs on? But primarily that core ECC, and what's the seller going to give you? You should have a very strong opinion on what that is, and you might need to be prepared to push for that. We work with sellers who then say, well, but the buyer wants this. We work with buyers who say, but the seller wants this. So almost regardless of what's in the TSA, there is some wrestling to be done to work out what you're going to get. And I think you want to go into this as a buyer, or if you have a responsibility within the business being sold, for what you're going to get. And a carve out of an SAP system is typically going to be more advantageous than a set of extracts, which then leads you to running straight into an implementation program.
Yeah, and I think, and we can widen this out a little bit, right, as well, Ben, because we talked there about the sort of like the core SAP aspect in the middle, but you also need to know, well, what am I getting in terms of that wider application landscape? Are there things that are going to be other applications that are key to the business that will come across, or will I need to figure out what I'm going to do about those and what we're going to replace them with? And another aspect that we see quite often is, certainly when we're with larger sellers, will the buyer be missing certain business functions? So maybe they've always relied on group functions for part of their, I don't know, as an example, their accounts payable function. Maybe that was a group function, and now that business isn't going to have that anymore. So what are we going to do about that, right? How do those business capabilities and application capabilities what will happen with those? So again, key to understand what forms part of that acquisition. And like you say, how is it going to be realized? Is it data extracts in some way? Is it systems? Is it copies of systems? Is it licensing? What constitutes the purchase, I guess, is a really key aspect.
A lot of customers who run SAP are kind of manufacturing businesses to some extent, whether that's whether they consider themselves manufacturing or chemical, but and in those scenarios, it would be very common, and you would expect that the operational. So we're talking, in terms of what are you going to get, and what may stay, what might be a group function on the seller side. That's both in terms of systems, functions and systems, but also people. The operational people, the factory floor, they're probably coming, but accounts payable, those people probably not coming.
Mm-hmm.
So so that there's that kind of separation. You need to know about that. There's also something that crops up a lot is this concept of a logical separation. So what you've agreed to buy may not be represented within the seller systems as at a company code level, something that can easily be separated. It could be a line of products or a set of profit centers, and that normally means that the seller is going to run some kind of logical separation, so almost like a re-implementation on a set of new company codes within their own SAP system before that can be then carved out. So if you're thinking that you're going to get, I don't know, let's say 15 years of historical data as part of this carve, and you would expect that as part of a carve out, you're going to get all the historical data that comes with that company code. That's what comes with that company code. And if that company code has only been recently created as part of a logical separation, then you're maybe only going to get 6 months or a year of data that comes with that. So all of this is is detail that you need to know and be prepared for as you go into this.
And with all of these things, there's no right and wrong, but I think it's really important to understand what you're going to go and get from the get-go, so that the ongoing project and any gaps that may need to be filled in that organization are very, very clear from the outset, right? So that plans can be put in place to address it.
Yeah, and that's where it comes back to the point we made at the beginning, which is that we focus on this very much from an SAP, from an IT, but very much from an SAP perspective. But this is a business separation. This is we talk about carve out in the sense of carving out from SAP, but at a business level, when they're talking about carve outs, they're talking about carving out a business and everything that means. So yeah, you've got to understand that wider context. So we've talked about know what you're going to get, but what about the second point, Stephen, which is know what your target is?
Yeah, where's it all going? So, and again, equally important to understand what this is going to be from the get-go, right? So, having a clear understanding of what your target environment's going to be. So if you're an industry buyer, maybe you know what that target environment is because it's something you've already got up and running and you're subsuming that organization into. But it might be that you still need an interim transition state. So, just from a pure systems and infrastructure point of view, where's that going to run? Where's that going to be operated? How are you going to get access to that? If you are let's say private equity buyer, then again, when that system's carved out, where is that going to reside? Okay, is it going to be an on-premise environment, a cloud environment? From an SAP standpoint, what sort of commercial model, licensing model around that is going to be put in place? So there's things to understand at that level. And again, depending on what you're buying, you might be buying, say, an ECC system, but ultimately your target state needs to be moving towards S/4HANA. How is that going to be addressed? Is that part of the transition? Is that a sort of multi-stage approach? When are you going to be doing that? Is that as you'll move to cloud potentially post-separation or during that separation? So those are really important things to understand. Again, what's that target architecture? What's that sort of target infrastructure that's going to run that? And that's just about the SAP focus, right? And again, depending on what that SAP estate is, because again, Ben, typically that's not just ECC. There will be potentially other SAP components in the mix. Some of them may need addressing very, very quickly because they might be coming to end of life. Some of those might be the more target state applications. But what about all the non-SAP and non-ERP applications? Where are those going to be? What's going to happen with those? They may be cloud applications where the buyer just needs to procure the right licensing, and then the connectivity will be, fairly obtainable, right, in the project. But they might need to go and replace application A with application B, and again there might be transition states. So understanding that's going to be really, really key. I think the other important point on the sort of target, I mean, again, coming, as NTT and being a key SAP partner, understanding how you're going to license that. I mean, there are different scenarios that might be playing out as the buyer. You may be acquiring some software licenses as part of this. It's not common, but it can happen. Typically, you won't have any, and you'll need to procure some. So what are you going to be procuring, right? And where from, and at what sensible commercial rationale? So all of that needs to be understood as soon as possible, because some of those things are not quick things to address, right? Sometimes there's a lot of time spent provisioning systems, securing the right commercial and licensing construct. So again, having a view, and this is shaped by what you're buying to a degree, but understanding what that target state is going to look like is really, really key. I mean, even Ben, we've spoken about this before, and we've touched on it a little bit as we've gone through. Is that target going to be running broadly the systems that were in place when the organization was part of the larger organization? Are those no longer fit for purpose? And actually, there does need to be some form of re-implementation of something. Again, understanding that at the beginning, really, really key.
Yeah, and it's quite a common situation as well that the seller's landscape is on premise, and the target landscape, almost always when it involves a carve out from SAP, is going to be cloud hosted, right? and RISE. Realistically, they're almost always RISE now. So you're going from an environment where where the selling organization managed that system to something that SAP is going to be managing in that technical management of the systems in the cloud. And what does that mean? We see customers that have been carved out from a seller. It's now being run in RISE. They don't necessarily know what that means in terms of what they're going to be allowed and what they're not going to be allowed, what's included in that contract or not.
And even down to which hyperscaler they're going to choose to run it on, right? That may have been nothing that they had to concern themselves with in their previous life, but now they're going to have to fairly quickly make some decisions on where that target platform is going to reside, even within the RISE construct, right? I mean, you have choices about hyperscaler, therefore you need to be informed enough to make that choice in terms of that target landscape.
Yeah. So we talked there about the end target state, if you like, which is not the same then as how do you get there. And I think the next 2 points are more focused around how do you get there, and how do you balance the requirement to do this quickly versus the requirement that the longer term value generation related to the acquisition of this business. So looking first at speed, and I think we've already talked about this a little bit, is you're going to be very much driven by the terms of the TSA, by the date by which you need to be off the seller's systems, and therefore potentially the penalties associated with not being off those systems in time. And we just touched on this already, that an implementation project would start with requirements, work a timeline from that, so kind of left-right planning, whereas a divestment is very much or an acquisition is very, the project plan associated with that is going to be very much driven by when do we need to be off these systems and work back to what's achievable based on that. So that's one reason why these projects tend to be simple separations rather than complex transformations. Another reason would be the seller's interests. The seller will very rarely agree to playing a role in the buyers or the divested entities' longer plans for value realization. So let's say let's say the seller's on ECC and the buyer's thinking it wouldn't be a huge uplift if as part of this separation we were to upgrade to S4. You can have that question with the seller, but is the seller going to agree with that? Or is the seller going to say, listen, all we're going to give you is a carved out system. If you want to upgrade to S4HANA following that, that's on you. So
I guess even with the TSA, Ben, I mean, it's probably fair to say that, say the TSA was 12 months, I mean, the seller's still got a desire to have that business carved out as quickly as possible, right? It's in their interest as well to have that take less than 12 months, because again, we spoke last time, their focus has shifted to the rest of their business. So everyone's interest, right, to not only go not beyond the TSA, but to go quicker than the TSA as well.
That's right. And then, yeah, this is one of the key areas where, you know, they've emotionally divested the seller. They want this done. They've moved on. You know, they're as you said, their focus is elsewhere. Whereas the buyer is thinking in terms of, you know, in terms of the value to this business. So that's something definitely to consider, where, you know, where speed is going to be a factor, and that's going to be driven by the seller, and that's going to be driven by the TSA. But there's also a question around kind of operational capacity. So, but you know, on your own side, you know, you used to be part of this much larger organization. You know, you maybe don't have a standalone IT function. So how much can you really drive as part of this kind of project? And also your SAP capability. It may be fairly minimal at this stage. You know, you need to go and invest in your own SAP team. So there's a number of factors there that would drive you towards this being a pretty quick, simple separation project. So the seller's on SAP, you know, the logical separation has happened. It's going to be a very simple carve out of the systems or of the company codes that have been bought into a new shell version of that system on RISE. That's probably where all of that leads. But then, and Stephen, maybe this is where you can come in a bit more. How do you balance that against the buyer's commercial priorities, which is to drive value from this, if this is private equity, let's say over a 4 to 5 year timeline?
And this is really I guess the tricky aspect of all of this, right? Balancing speed and low risk and certainty on the separation against, actually, like you say, the whole reason for the purchase was to drive value out of that organization. So I guess there's a few things that I guess the first thing to say is there's no easy or right and wrong answer in this, right? There's a series of balanced judgments that need to be taken. But one thing, I guess, there's a few things that come to mind. So it's probably worth saying that from the get-go, you can make your architectural decisions part of that whole value realization and value decision. So when you look at your wider application landscape and SAP as well, making sure that you've bought the right amount of things, and you've got a clear view about what you're retaining, replacing, or optimizing. You know, make that part of that whole value journey from the beginning, right? In terms of how you're going to set out that wider architecture. So again, we keep using the word speed. I think it's safe to say, Ben, that we are particularly passionate about the speed being a key thing within a divestment deal, because the speed is going to protect the multiple that can be achieved, but actually it's the optimization that potentially you can do after this that grows it. So what we want to do is make sure that we get the carve out done. Again, we're talking generally, right? Because there'll always be nuanced particular rationales for each particular deal, but in general, get the carve out done really, really quickly. That protects the deal value. But then the trick then is identifying where we can optimize and simplify and automate a lot of the SAP processes. So again, painting a scenario where we are being divested from a larger organization, and we touched on it earlier, potentially the processes and the applications aren't really suitable for a much smaller business. They were suitable when you were 100% of a large organization, but when you're now a 10% size business, they're not really that suitable. So the way to achieve the value, I mean, it sounds simple, but you need to understand where you can optimize and automate, and have a plan early on about how you're going to realize that really quickly. So, because quite often there is a massive desire from the buyer to do those things really, really quickly, and actually to do them as part of the carve-out project, which, whilst technically possible, we always try to advise against, because again, you've got that TSA aspect in mind. But what we do believe, and where we think there's some gains to be had, is not waiting until the carve-out project has been done to identify what those areas are and planning for them. Get that done as early as possible, so that the moment that the business has been separated, you can move straight into that value realization plan. Right, that's one of the key things. So it's about having early visibility. Again, there's some caveats there. That requires the operational capacity to work with organizations such as NTT and Xmateria to identify where those are. Getting that identification done allows us to, and the business, to quickly drive into that value realization piece.
Yeah, so the decision's going to be is whether you do that as a one-step project, which is, so let's say, this may be the case particularly with private equity, where the business that's being sold is much smaller than the selling entity, where you may be extracting data from a system in order to migrate that into a new public cloud environment, or maybe a non-SAP environment, if that's the decision, or whether you're going to do a carve as a first step and then rework it. One of the things we've seen, we've worked on this a couple of times, is when you're doing a carve out, you would normally assume that's into a shell copy of the source system. But we've seen a couple of times where the buyer has said, I don't want a shell copy. I want the carve out, but I don't want a shell copy of that, that 20 terabyte source system with all its huge complexity. What we're going to do is we're going to build our own ECC shell, and then we'll tell you what the differences are. And sometimes the seller will go along with that. So it's kind of a halfway step. You take a lot of weight out of that system as part of the carve out. But yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on there. Is don't think about that after you've done the separation. Is know what that end, and that's where we started, wasn't it? Is know what the target's going to look like, and then work back to how many steps is it going to take you, and what's the involvement of the seller in terms of getting you towards that end target.
The other thing we see quite often is that, just thinking about SAP, right? I mean, it's a very, very powerful platform, and it's always the case that an organization isn't maximizing what that platform can deliver. Right? And there might be constraints when they were part of a larger organization that actually it needed to work in a certain way, and they're not maybe making the best use of SAP. So, the really quick thing and sensible thing to do is make sure that the business can leverage all the capabilities that are inherent in that platform, right? Because again, they've unshackled themselves, so they're now a bit more in control of their destiny and how they want those processes to be. So making sure that you look at that standard capability and adopt it in the right time period, right, as quickly as you possibly can. That's another thing that we see that they can give a business real value.
And the question is do you do that? Do you do a very quick carve out so that you can get on with that, or can you somehow find a way to
like a single step approach
through the separation? That's it. And I think all of that is leading towards our fifth and final kind of tip there, which is get ahead of this. So as a buyer, know your target, know your objectives. Don't wait for the seller to tell you what you're going to get as part of this separation. Know what you would like them to give. Be aware of what's in the TSA. Ideally, influence the TSA. Ideally, as an IT organization, you would be involved enough to have had some kind of influence on that TSA. Often that's not the case. So be prepared. If you're not completely happy with what's in the TSA, to fight your corner, because it's still in everybody's interest to make this work and make it happen quickly. So have a very clear view of what you want to achieve long term and how you're going to get there. I think they're key points. And we would also say, and this can be difficult sometimes as a buyer. It's much easier if you're working with the seller, but we would say to the buyer, when you're looking at that when you're looking at that host SAP system from which the business you're buying is going to be carved out, find some way to do some discovery on that. Know what that's going to look like. Know what kind of data sits within that before you do it. So we work with a lot of customers on those kind of data discovery projects. It's obviously much easier if you're working with the seller ahead of a carve out. But if you're on the buy side, push for that kind of discovery exercise so that you know ahead of time what it is you're going to be getting as part of this carve out. I think that they would be some key points for me in terms of getting ahead.
You know what you're not going to get, right, as well. It's as important as knowing what you are going to get. Be clear about what will stay behind with seller, so that again you've got early sight about what plans you might need to put in place.
Yeah, particularly if they've got some almost bespoke or their own IP in systems that is not going to come across. And some of that is driven as well by how competitive the new business is going to be versus the seller. Is this an industry that the seller wants to get out of, in which case they're going to be a bit more flexible, or is this a business that it is going to end up competing with the seller, in which case they're going to be much less willing to accommodate your preferences. Yeah, so they're the key. They're the 5 points. Catherine, if you're still there, have we had any questions come in that we can address? Because I think we've maybe got another five and a bit minutes still to go.
Yeah, lovely. We've actually had a few questions come through. So we had one from our last webinar, so I'll start with that one that we didn't get to answer. So that was which parts of the project risk overrunning and why, and then how do you avoid this?
I've got a very strong view on that one, I think. If this was, if we were talking to an organization who was looking to implement, like an implementation project, moving from non-SAP to SAP or from ECC to S4, and they're doing a greenfield new implementation, then that would be a very different answer. That is a lot about the change that they're going to be going through in terms of process and solution, and how do you understand what that change is, and how do you draw the line between what needs to happen to the data and the solution change that's going to happen as part of the project. And that's where those kind of projects get complicated. If we assume that this is a carve-out, it's not that kind of project. And we've talked about this. Normally, those carve-outs are very much a like-for-like separation, very little in the way of transformation. But what they do tend to be is quite performance intensive. You could be carving out genuinely billions of records from an SAP system into a shell. So the seller's going to be very conscious of the potential impact on their system. You've maybe got a weekend window in order to make this happen. There's going to be a lot of standing up of production copies and new shell systems. So a lot of technical work. And in my experience, if you've got the right, if you're dealing with this project with the right kind of software, and we would tend to work with the Natuvion DCS software, which you obviously work with as well, Stephen, because that now falls within the NTT group. If you're working with the right kind of software, then the actual project requirements and execution of it is relatively straightforward. These are highly repeatable technical projects. But the performance and the requirements to stand up shells and copies, and and maybe that's an SI like NTT that would be doing that. Maybe that's the customer themselves. That's where the delays happen. That ability to take quick production copies and be ready to stand up shells and do that in a highly repeatable way from the first test cycle to the second to the dress rehearsal. That's where we see a lot of issues. And so I'd be very
wholeheartedly agree with that, Ben. I think the other thing I'd add is in terms of projects overrunning. So in my experience, what can sometimes happen is so when it's not clear exactly what the sort of wider application landscape would be. So what does SAP need to integrate to? When that's not clear from the beginning, that can sometimes lead to delays. Or when things are change along the way. Instead of using application X we're not using Concur for expenses, there's now another application we're going to go and use. That now means that I can't rely on the integration that we had previously. There's new things to go and build, and that always drags in complexity. So depending on the amount of change at that level, that's also something that can potentially cause projects to run the risk of overrunning, I think.
That's right. I think in a greenfield implementation of an S/4HANA system, you would say the solution is the main work stream, the lead work stream. But data follows behind, but everything does follow behind that lead solution work stream. In a carve out, I would say it's data, it's integration, so interfacing, and what you've just talked about there, Stephen, and it's then the technical work stream in terms of standing things up very quickly and copies.
People and the change management potentially in that as well.
Always people, yeah. It always ends up being people at the end of it, doesn't it? Catherine, was there? That was an answer to the first question.
Thank you. There's a few more. Potentially this might be the last one, depending on timing. But we've got, would you recommend that the seller does an internal carve to a separate company code if the part being sold is not already an independent company code?
Well, that's a great question, isn't it? So, I mean, I'll go first, Ben, and you can,
first,
you can sort of add something in. I think in an ideal world, that would be the recommendation, right? That it's that because it makes it carveable. So that's going to be simpler technically, and and lower risk. So that's utopia. I guess the dynamic is whether that's going to be achievable or not, because that potentially requires the seller to have carried out that work. And whilst it's sort to a degree in their interest, because it makes the carve project more contained and lower risk, it does mean that they've had to do some pre-work. So I think it's our desired state. Whether it's achievable or not is a little bit to do with the dynamics of the sale and the buy-sell relationship. I mean, Ben, I don't know what your view on that would be.
Yeah, I'd probably go a little bit further. So I would say, so a carve at company code level is the ideal. That's the easiest. The way SAP is structured, everything comes from that company code down. We've definitely done a number of carves where there's a plant in addition to the company. So let's say one or multiple company codes plus a plant. That is relatively straightforward as well. You do find that as you go through the test cycles, every defect you get, every issue that needs to be looked into is somehow related to that plant, because the financial data that relates to that plant isn't organized at plant level. So you've kind of got to work your way back to the finance data. But company code plus plant is very achievable. I think once you go beyond that into kind of lines of product, where it's going to be very hard. It's not just the carve out that becomes more complicated. It's the reconciliation. It's being able to everybody being able to say, at the end of a test cycle, yes, that is correct. That's comprehensive. That's accurate.
Haven't got everything. It's hard. The definition of everything is harder, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I would say then then there's a much stronger argument for having done a logical separation in advance. But if it's at company code or company plus plant, then I would say you probably don't need to do the logical separation. Yes, but obviously you need to look at it in detail. But company plus plant would be very achievable. Any others, Catherine? I think we've got a couple of minutes, maybe.
Yeah, no problem. So we've also got another one, which is how do you best manage a cold carve when the seller only wants to provide flat files and no system copy?
So if what you want as a buyer is not the flat files, then push very hard to get a carve out of a running business. So push very hard. Actually, I think it's in the interests of the seller as well to do a carve out, because even though it's maybe counterintuitive that it sounds like a carve out is going to be more complex, there's a lot more data than just a set of extracts object by object by object. It's a much simpler, more repeatable process. So I think there's a very strong argument for encouraging the seller to actually deliver a selective carve or a clone and delete rather than to provide extracts. So I would go that route first. If the seller insists, and there are some organizations that do this when they divest, they say all you're ever going to get from us is a set of extracts, then you want to know that during the TSA. I would say during the negotiation of the deal, ideally that would be the time to have that conversation, because if you haven't bought the organization yet, if you haven't bought that business, then you've got much more leverage in negotiation. But if that's what you end up with, and that's all you're going to get is a set of extracts, then yeah, it's not going to be a carve-out. Then you're going to have to move into kind of implementation, and you want to know that as soon as possible. Yeah, so our advice there would be to know about that in advance and try to change that decision, because otherwise, all you are going to get is you're going to have to run an acquisition, an implementation project. You're going to have to bring that in to your organization, and then you're looking at a kind of a mini greenfield style project, migrating data object by object into a target solution that hasn't been built for that acquisition.
So, and in that scenario, Ben, you're still going to need something to make sure that you can manage because there may well be some transformation of that data needed. I mean, so clearly the source and target are going to be different, but they may be radically different. I mean, we were speaking earlier about scenarios where actually the seller isn't even on SAP, but the buyer wants it to be on SAP. So there's, potentially all sorts of data transformation that needs to be thought through in that scenario. But it all comes back to that. All those things we were saying earlier, right? Know what you're going to get, and know what your target's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Catherine, we've probably run over a little. Do we have any more?
Yeah, we do have one more that we could maybe cover briefly. Do you think you have time?
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, if people are happy just to stay on for 2 more minutes, let's cover that last question.
Lovely. So it's when considering a VC purchase, what measures can you take to keep the newly bought org carve ready for a future sale?
Okay, so venture capital purchase, I guess it's going to be the same for private equity. One thing private equity tend not to do is bring an acquisition into an existing system. So whereas an industry buyer may bring an acquisition into their existing SAP or non-SAP ERP system, they would do that because their view is they're going to bring this in and run that business for the next 10 or 20 years and then may never sell it. Whereas private equity would normally look at this on maybe a 5-year timeline. So they buy a business, but eventually they're aiming to sell that business. So it doesn't make sense to then bring that into an existing system, with a whole load of other businesses, only then to have to carve it out again. So in a private equity or I'm not sure about VC. I mean, VC is going to be a minority owner normally. So VC is an investor. They wouldn't normally get involved in the operation of a business, but private equity is often going to be the majority owner. So they would get to make that decision. So in a private equity, so let's assume we're talking about a private equity scenario here, then you would normally be pushing for a carve out of the business you've bought into a standalone environment on cloud, so that if you sell that again in 5 years, you just hand over the whole thing to a buyer. Would you agree, Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary, Ben.
Okay. That's question. So I think let's wrap up now. I think the one thing, if it hasn't come through already, I think that the one thing we would say, we would obviously, people who are going through this scenario, whether as a seller or the focus today as a buyer or as the business being sold, we would obviously say to talk to us, talk to Stephen, talk to me about how this might work. But more importantly, I think it would be talk to us early. That would always be talk to us well ahead of time, as early as possible. So many projects go down a route that leads to increased risk and cost, and that there are often ways to dilute that and to mitigate any risks. For those that have lasted the course and stayed with us through to the end of this, thank you very much for joining us. Stephen, thank you for your time.
Pleasure as always.
These last couple of webinars. Catherine, thanks for your help as well today, and goodbye.